Good morning, guys.
Good morning.
I just posted an announcement on the Blackboard course site indicating what you needed to have completed by the 30th of March. That's roughly, about 17 days from today. We will have class. Our next live session will be Tuesday, March 31, at which point I will discuss your assignment, paper assignment number 3, in detail. And that is going to be due on April 23rd. So it's not quite 6 weeks from today. Going to be due on April 23rd. So today what I want to do is to finish up on political parties, and if I have the time, to do the first few slides for Chapter 9, because the rest will be covered. Again, you need to refer to the announcement that I just created this morning on the Blackboard site so that you know what to do. I'm going to try to do the initial piece that's not covered in the video lecture this morning on media, and then all the other material, video lectures, the PowerPoint, everything is there for you to do. So we're going to go back to political parties right now, and just where we left off, which is basically to reiterate that we talked about the 3 faces of political parties, which are reflected in this image, and the fact that it is a political organization. Party is a political organization that has its own organization, its organization in government, as well as its organization in the electorate. So this chart, which I'm not quite sure how well you can read, is designed to show you that those people who are party activists, doesn't matter whether they're Democrats or Republicans, tend to be either, if they're Republicans, more conservative than people who normally vote Republican, and the Democratic delegates to the National Convention tend to be more liberal than those who vote Democratic. So in other words, those who participate the most frequently in the 2 major political parties tend to be either more liberal or more conservative than the electorate as a whole. They also tend to be they tend to have more information, they tend to have higher levels of interest. So one of the issues we want to talk about this morning is, why does the 2-party system endure? If you ask a lot of people that you run into, are you a D or an R? And they say, well, I'm not really either. I don't like political parties. I try to vote for the person. Without getting into the wisdom of that kind of position, there are good reasons why the 2-party system has endured. First of all, it has a long historical foundation, going back well over 100 years, closer to 150 or even more years. Secondly, we've studied political socialization, and in fact, many people in our country are, when they're young, they're taught that their family is either Republican or Democratic. There are also practical considerations that I'd like to discuss. One is that we tend to have a winner-take-all electoral system. Whether you're looking at the Electoral College, whether you're looking at the way senators are elected, or the way judges are elected, or the way House representatives are elected, we live in a winner-take-all electoral system. There are a variety of electoral systems in the world. There are a variety of representative systems in the world. The one that we use, for example, for congressional districts, House districts, is what's called single-member district. What does that mean? It means that one person will be elected to be the representative for that congressional district and will be seated as a member of the House of Representatives. It doesn't matter whether the vote is 90 to 10 or 50.01 to 49.99, only one person is elected as a representative. And so this single-member district system basically reinforces a two-party system, because the way, how do you know how you can be elected? All you need to do is get 50% plus one of the votes. So that also creates a voter disincentive. If you've got primarily a two-party system, people who might consider an alternative candidate to the two major parties have to face the problem that almost certainly their vote is going to be quote-unquote wasted. That is, that the person that they're going to vote for is not going to win. And so that is a disincentive that many voters feel with respect to how to vote in an election when it's almost certain that either the Republican or Democrat is going to win. And there's state and federal laws as well that favor the two-party system. We'll talk about this in a minute. So in presidential voting, for example, in the Electoral College, we have the same phenomena. That is, if a candidate for president, say the Democratic Party's presidential candidate gets 50.1% of the vote, but doesn't even need that. Whichever candidate gets the plurality of the vote in a state gets all of the Electoral College votes, unless one of the electors decides, or more, decide to vote for another candidate. But if they do that, given the system, and we'll talk about that in the next session, in the next class session, they would be in political trouble. So there are only two states that are an exception to this, and I believe they're Nebraska and Maine, that divide up their Electoral College votes based on who wins the congressional districts in their state. But other than that, it's winner take all. So if a candidate gets 50.1% of the vote in Indiana, or just a plurality of the vote in Indiana for president, they get all of the Electoral College votes, almost certainly. Proportional representation is another form of representation that would break down by percentages the representation, so that there would be multiple representatives in one state or district or what have you, but that's not our system. Sometimes locals, the city councils have that system in some cities, but we don't have that in national government. You know, one of the things I suggested is state laws affect and support the two-party system. Keep in mind, every single state legislative body in the United States, for God knows how long, has been controlled by the Democratic or Republican Party, because we have a two-party system. In many states, those men and women, those legislators, write the laws that determine whether or not and the conditions under which a minor party can gain access to the ballot. And there are all kinds of procedures and regulations, and they vary from state to state. Sometimes in order to get on the ballot, a party has to get a certain percentage of the most recent vote in the gubernatorial election. Sometimes they have to gather signatures, and they have to gather so many signatures in so many counties across the state, and many times the number of signatures can be very high in order to get on the ballot. So, and again, these laws vary state by state, and the point is that in many states, that whether it's the Democrats in control or the Republicans that are in control, they know between them that one of them is going to be in control in the state legislature, and so they write laws that make it harder for third parties to gain meaningful access to the ballot. And if their candidates, if a party's candidates aren't on the ballot, pretty hard to get elected. Third parties, I'm defining really as any political party at this point other than the Democratic or Republican Party. Usually they're based on one or more issues, an ideology, and or a region, or some combination thereof. Often they split off from major parties and are organized around maybe a charismatic leader or at least an identifiable leader. Excuse me. So here you can see a chart of some of the more well-known third-party presidential campaigns since 1864. Perhaps the candidacy, the progressive candidacies of Theodore Roosevelt and Robert La Follette are notable. In the middle of the 20th century, the candidacies of Strom Thurmond, Harry Byrd, and George Wallace reflect the, generally speaking, southern states and opposition to civil rights and support for states' rights. But none of them, the most successful in terms of numbers was Ross Perot in 1992. Before that, you have to go back to George Wallace in 1968 to find a candidate. So really, there's only been, in the last almost 50 years, only two candidates. Actually, in the last 90 years, there's been 3 third-party candidates who have reached double digits nationally in terms of the vote. And these are some of the policies and parties that are represented in that chart. I'm not going to go through that, but you can take a look at it as you go through the PowerPoint. What's important here is that third parties offer political perspectives and policy views that almost certainly go beyond what's represented by the two major parties. They might be ideological parties. They see themselves as outsiders. They're psychologically cohesive. Their goal is not immediate electoral success because they know they're very unlikely to win elections, but they want to stake out an ideological or a policy position that they feel is not being adequately reflected in the policies of the federal government. There are also splinter parties, that among those that we just looked at over the past 100+ years, which are dissident factions or groups within major parties that split off and form their own party. The impact of minor parties or third parties tends to be twofold. One is obviously the Republican and Democratic parties compete. They compete for votes. They compete to control the institutions of the national government, and so they have some incentive to try to appeal to those who are supporting a third party, even as they're influenced perhaps by those parties. So both parties, major parties, have an interest in finding ways to appeal to the voters who are apparently supporting a third party or a minor party candidacy. Sometimes third parties can affect election outcomes and play a spoiler role. The most obvious and important example of that was the example of Ralph Nader in the state of Florida in the 2000 election. If Ralph Nader had not been on the ballot, it's very likely that George W. Bush would never have been president, and that Al Gore would have been elected in the year 2000. So we want to say something about broader electoral change, and as a kind of introduction to the material in the next chapter. Political scientists use several different terms that it's important to know and understand as a way they think about elections. First is realignment. And that concept is used to discuss or to describe major changes in the electoral or the voting behavior and party allegiance of certain segments of the American population. When there's a realignment, a party realignment, what they are saying is that there's a significant longer-term shift in the voting public, such that a party that had been out of power comes into power and remains in power for some period of time. The idea of de-alignment refers to a decline in party loyalties in the American electorate generally, and in a minute I'll show you a chart that demonstrates what de-alignment is in American politics. And thirdly is the concept of tipping. This is when a group becomes more numerous over time and it grows large enough to change the political balance. And probably that if one were to use that term in American electoral politics today, Latinos might be the demographic group that would be a constituency that might tip the partisan balance over time in American politics. And down here we have different kinds of voting behavior, and we'll talk more about that another time. So the concept of de-alignment is one that describes weakening voter party identification, whether it's identification with the Democratic or Republican Party. It's a decline in voter reliance on party identification as a factor in voter choice, in voting. And it's often accompanied by an increase in split ticket voting, meaning a voter who votes sometimes for, in an election votes for some Democrats and some Republicans. And split ticket voting and de-alignment may be more likely to be associated with divided government. What we mean by divided government is where different parties, different major parties control different institutions of the national government, meaning the House of Representatives, the Senate, and the White House. Nonetheless, party ID remains a strong influence in voter choice, even though we have evidence of de-alignment, which I'm going to show you here. So this is a chart that covers roughly 70 years. And what we can see is that in 1944, when Franklin Roosevelt was president, there was a large Democratic majority in the roughly 2-to-1 in the electorate. And over the course of several decades, that began to decline. That gap between Democratic Party identifiers and Republican Party identifiers began to decline. And so if you want to understand divided government, where divided government comes from, and how it's reflected, you can see that, in fact, and where de-alignment comes from, you can see that the Democratic Party identifiers dropped from 40 to 31, and the Republican Party identifiers dropped from 40 to 27%. And what's happened? The number of people, voters who describe themselves as independents, has doubled, or as a percentage of the electorate, over the course of 70 or so years. And so this is a good example of what de-alignment looks like. It's a good example of the weakening of party identification. Both the likelihood of no single party being dominant in American national government, and in swings from back and forth from one party to another party, usually over a very short period of time, because while there are still more party identifiers in the electorate, it's also the case that the number of people or voters who describe themselves as independents is greater than the combination of the party identifiers. Any comments or questions at this point?
No. Nope. They said no. We're good.
Okay. So what I'd like to do is load some content here. And I'm going to try to get through the first section of the Chapter 9 PowerPoint that is not available on the video lectures. This will pop up in a minute. Okay, so what I want to remind you of the course and textbook organization. The first 5 chapters dealt with the political framework for American national government. Chapters 6, 7, 8, and 9, we're now just beginning to discuss Chapter 9, focuses on political processes. And so this chapter, Chapter 9, is the last chapter that deals with political processes, and once we're done with this chapter, we're moving into a discussion of governmental institutions. Okay, so how should we understand the media? I would understand them as corporate political actors. Most political experience and information that we receive is mediated by the mass media. And the media is regulated by the Federal Communications Commission, as well as protected in large measure by the First Amendment. But one of the things we'll see is that the ownership of the mass media in the United States is highly concentrated. And we'll also see that, in fact, the mass media companies are private companies, often multinational companies, or very large corporations. And one of the challenges of the FCC is to see that these entities serve the public interest, not just their own corporate interests. Just to give you an idea of how people think about the media, there have been a number of studies done, and they show that the most unpopular corporation in the country is Comcast. And Comcast is one of the most important media corporate actors in the country. So when thinking about the mass media today, it seems to me there's two somewhat contradictory features. On the one hand, they may ultimately become compatible with one another, but they're not right now. One is there's a corporate concentration of the mass media, and by that what I mean is that fewer and fewer companies are involved in the news and the news gathering business. And we'll look at those in a minute. On the other hand, it's also true that there's a diversification of media types, in large part because of new media. How should we understand media and politics? Well, media has become a group of political actors. They're companies, they're large corporations that make profits. They're interested in eyeballs and entertainment. And by the way, how do they make profits? They make profits by getting more eyeballs and thus selling advertising. So a lot of what comes in the way of profits for media corporations is the sale of advertising. Media companies report news and information as well as misinformation. There are a number of studies, for example, that demonstrate that Fox News routinely broadcasts misinformation, and that in fact those who use Fox News as their primary source of political information are the most misinformed people in the American electorate. I'm not making this up. You can go online, Google it. There are a whole number of studies that all come out with the same findings. Mass media do identify selected public issues and problems. They help focus our attention on certain issues rather than others because they can't talk about all issues. They don't have time. They don't have the resources. They don't have the journalistic capacity to do it. They also socialize us to the dominant political culture. They're looking at the main stories of the day. And often those main stories are provided by people who are already in office. The mass media can provide a political forum, and it often does so for government officials, parties, and candidates. If you can look at the Sunday morning talk shows, and almost invariably members of political parties and those who hold public office are those who are interviewed. And there is some still, though decreasing role for mass media as a government watchdog. One of the reasons it's decreasing is because, excuse me, the kind of investigative journalism that's required to serve the watchdog function is very expensive. And the watchdog function takes a long time to develop that story and then produce it. And so in terms of the profitability of such an enterprise, it's probably very low and maybe even non-existent. So what does the media do? Well, mass media political power is rooted in agenda setting and framing. Agenda setting means that the media have the power to bring to the public's attention particular issues and problems and not others. And part of what politics and the strategy of politics is about is to raise some issues as very important to the public and to the American people, and to public policy, and to consider others much less significant or insignificant. And then the second power of the media is framing. Once we have an issue or an event to discuss, once those selections are made, how are we to interpret these things. And so this can have a significant impact on how we think about politics. The most recent example, in my judgment, of, well, shall we say, the limits or the weaknesses of the mass media is the discussion, the excessive discussion of Secretary of State Hillary Clinton's email usage. This is already in the past, number one. Number two, most people who are very powerful, frankly, don't know that much about the internet or email. And number three, the woman has been politically important for several decades. She has a record. Okay, I'm not saying what she did is right, wrong, or in between. What I'm saying is she is a major candidate, probably, though still unannounced, for President of the United States. She's been in public life for over 2 decades. What has she done? What has she stood for? What would she do as president? Those things matter. What she does with email is insignificant by comparison. TV news. Media is involved, obviously, in producing and distributing TV news. It reaches more people than any other news source, but it provides a little depth of coverage. For example, the average quote 30-minute, or maybe it's closer to 20-minute news show on a major TV network would take up maybe one total column of the front page of the New York Times. This is nothing. This is a soundbite. This is not the news. This is a small sliver of the news of what's going on that day. So it's important to keep in mind just how minimal the news from major networks is. Now, there are some cable networks, news networks, that are 24/7, but even they have a lot of repetition. Generally speaking, TV news is a mediocre source of political and election information. It tends to be more visual. It tends to be more superficial. It tends to be focused on personality and sound bites. When it gets to elections, the interest of networks in describing elections is to make sure that there's a horse race. Why? Because that brings in eyeballs. Because eyeballs sell advertising at higher rates than if there are fewer eyeballs. The best example, recent example, is 2008 and the primary elections in the Democratic Party between Hillary Clinton and Barack Obama. What happened? Well, you may have been a bit too young to focus on that in a significant way, but I'm an old guy and a political scientist, so I looked at it very closely. Barack Obama won 13 primaries in a row over Hillary Clinton. 13. It has never happened, as far as I know, that any candidate for president in primaries who's run off 13 primary victories has not been the nominee of the party. But the major TV news channels and news shows wanted to make it seem that the question of who was going to be the party nominee was still up in the air. Okay? It was as up in the air as whether or not tomorrow is going to be Saturday. We all know tomorrow is going to be Saturday. We all know today is Friday. Friday's the 13th. When you win 13 primaries in a row, you're going to get the nomination. And yet, the media needed to make it appear as though this was still up in the air. It wasn't up in the air at all. So what is the mass media? These are some of the major mass media conglomerates: Clear Channel, Comcast, Disney, Viacom, CBS, News Corp, and Time Warner. And these are the major companies in the country that own and control most of the major media outlets. And here we can see a chart that demonstrates the increasing corporate concentration of the U.S. media over a period of roughly 35 years, a little over 30 years. I'm sorry, 20 years. So this is a 90% decline in the number of corporations controlling a majority of the U.S. media in literally a 20-year period. So that's a heavy, heavy increase in the concentrated ownership of media. News also has become nationalized. And what do I mean by that? Well, first, in the 20th century, national news gathering organizations emerged and became dominant. Excuse me. And this reinforced a broader nationalization of American politics, and we'll talk more about that in another lecture. There is, in fact, far less variation in national news and events reporting. Why is that so? First, large media organizations, like those that we just saw, own most of the major local newspapers and radio stations in the country. Second of all, most local TV stations are affiliated with these major networks and companies. Thirdly, the major company, there are just a handful now of major companies that actually gather news. The AP, Reuters, the New York Times, Washington Post. It's expensive to gather news. It's expensive to send people all over the world and to gather news and information to inform the American people. And very often it's not profitable. And so increasingly, just a handful of organizations are responsible for gathering the news and then distributing it to another handful of major media corporations. On the other hand, we have some new media that are important in politics. Some of them are still developing. We have talk radio. We have, at the same time, a declining role of newspapers except for elites. But you can look at any newspaper from, say, 30 years ago, look at the New York Times or the Cincinnati Enquirer, or whatever, almost any major newspaper. It is a business that's been under severe competition from the Internet. And what the Internet does, the newspapers and the major conglomerates tend not to do, is to provide variety, to provide depth, to provide timeliness and context. We have blogs. Anybody can post anything on the Internet. You know that. And it poses a problem for us as citizens in a democracy, because it means we have to figure out who is selling something and who is just full of bull and who has actually got real information that's accurate. But it also reflects this democratization of the Internet, and Internet information also reflects a political polarization. We also now have social media. We have Facebook, we have Twitter, we have Instagram, we have all kinds of things that we now can know because of people all over the world and all over our country who are posting images, photos, describing real-time events as they occur, and so on. And so that changes, in a significant way, the role of media in American political life. So the Internet may offer a greater diversity than TV news, and perhaps a deeper cultural penetration than the mainstream media, in part because if one just thinks about our own country, there are people all over every day who are posting information that never gets reported or mentioned on the mainstream media. it's also the case that there are people all over the world. Perhaps one of the best examples is there was a man in Pakistan who, as you may know, tweeted real time about the helicopters coming down in a Pakistani city and into Osama bin Laden's compound and killing him. Now, the man didn't know at the time that that's what the raid that was happening, but in real time, the man was tweeting that something's going on, and he would describe the noise and so on, and he got his 15 minutes of fame. The textbook suggests that the adversarial media, especially on the internet, but sometimes on TV as well, has become increasingly partisan. But there's another way of looking at it, probably more than one. An alternative explanation is that we have a proliferation of diverse media outlets, cable news channels, talk radio, websites, blogs, social media that reflect a broader diversity of views and information than traditional mass media. So that's all I have for this morning. The material on elections and campaigns, you can see those videos online in class sessions 9 and 10. The dates of those videos are October 28 and 29 and November 4. And for the November 4th video, you should view the first 29 minutes. You should view all of the October 28 and 29 videos and the first 29 minutes of the November 4 video, and that will take us then through all of Chapter 9 and get us to Chapter 10 on Congress in the beginning of our discussion of the national governmental institutions. I think if we do it this way, and this is really my concern here, I don't want to end up 5 chapters short for you with a week and a half to go at the end of May. The snow obviously caused all kinds of issues for you guys, and so what I'm trying to do is to make sure that we get the schedule and the calendar in line so that you can complete this work and this course fully and completely in the best way possible. So I think if we do this, if you can do the rest of Chapter 9 and the videos October 28, 29, and November 4, we'll be in good shape on the 31st for me to start to talk about Congress. So if there are no questions, I'll wish you a good senior travel week and a good spring break. Are there any comments first or questions?
Any comments, questions? None, sir.
If there are none, I'll see you next time.
All right, thank you.